In December of 1934, at the frozen bottom of the Great Depression, a machine operator in Cleveland tore open his year-end envelope and found a check large enough to buy a house. He didn't own the company, he was just the guy running a welder on the floor. And his boss, a stern man named James Lincoln, believed handing over that fortune was the smartest business decision he ever made. Most firms grow by squeezing the people who build things. This one did the opposite, and it never stopped winning. If you've ever struck an arc, run a bead, or watched sparks fly off fresh steel, drop a welder below. I want to know who's here, because while giant American names rose and crashed all around it, this quiet Ohio outfit refused to lay off a single employee for over 70 years, and became the most dominant welding empire the world has ever seen. To understand how that check ended up in a working man's hands, you have to go back to a $200 idea and two brothers who could not have been more different. The older one was John Lincoln. He was born in Ohio in 1866, the son of a preacher who traveled from town to town, and he grew up sharp with his hands and restless in his head. Electricity was brand new then, closer to magic than science, and John chased it. He studied under Charles Brush, the man who lit America's first electric streets. By the time he was 25, he had already patented a brake for railway cars. What he wanted was to invent things, not to run a company. But inventing costs money. So in December of 1895, with $200 to his name, John started a small shop in Cleveland to build electric motors of his own design. That was it. No welding, no factory. Just one gifted engineer and a design he believed in. For years, the business limped along, good enough to survive, and never quite good enough to soar. Here is the part almost nobody expects. The company that would one day arm the shipyards of a world war did not start with fire and steel at all. It started with a quiet man and a motor. John Lincoln would go on to hold more than 50 patents across his lifetime, a born inventor who lit up at a fresh problem and lost interest the moment it was solved. Running a payroll bored him, and the person who turned that motor shop into an empire had not even walked through the door yet. That person was John's younger brother, James. James Lincoln joined the family firm in 1907 as its one and only salesman. He earned $50 a month, plus a small cut of whatever he sold, and he was, by his own honest account, no expert in anything the company made. He knocked on doors. He learned the trade the hard way, one rejection at a time. And when John lost interest in the daily grind of running things, he handed the whole operation to his kid brother in 1914. James was 31 years old. What James did next did not look like genius at the time. It looked like humility. He knew the men on his factory floor understood the work better than he did, so he asked them. In 1914, he created an advisory board, a group of workers elected from every department, and he sat with them regularly to hear whatever was on their minds. No idea was too small to raise. That board still meets today, more than a century later. Out of those early conversations came things almost unheard of for the time: group life insurance for the workers in 1915 and paid vacations in 1923, among the first offered anywhere in the country. Think about what that meant to a laborer in 1915. Nobody was handing factory hands paid time off and insurance. But James had figured out something his rivals had not, and it would make him rich while it made his workers rich too. His insight was almost embarrassingly simple. If a man knows he will personally gain from working smarter, he will work smarter. So James built a pay system around it. Starting in 1915, Lincoln paid its people by the piece rather than the hour. Produce more good parts, earn more money. But he added a catch that kept the whole thing honest. If you rushed and made junk, the flaws were yours to fix on your own time. Speed alone earned nothing. Quality plus speed earned everything. The proof showed up in the raw numbers, and they are almost hard to believe. In 1921, building a single 200-amp welding machine took about 112 hours of direct labor. 2 decades later, under the same incentive system, that figure had dropped to under 20. The workers were not being driven harder by a stopwatch. They were finding smarter ways to do the job because every improvement landed in their own pockets. That is the quiet engine underneath the whole story. A floor full of people who thought like owners, because, in a real sense, they were. Then, in 1925, he let the workers buy stock in the company they were building. And in 1934, at the deepest, coldest point of the Great Depression, he handed out the first annual bonus based on merit. That is the check from the opening. While bread lines stretched around the block outside, Lincoln's people were opening envelopes that could change their year. The bonus has been paid every single year since. Not most years, every year. Which raises an obvious question. How does a company hand out fat rewards in the worst economy in living memory when businesses everywhere were shuttering their doors? The answer was a product, and a good one. During the Depression, Lincoln introduced an improved coated welding rod that laid down a cleaner, stronger seam than anything on the market. Contractors who could barely afford to keep the lights on could still afford a welder that saved them time and steel. Demand held when it had no right to. The right invention at the right moment kept the whole enterprise alive and kept those envelopes full. And here is the tell that this was no accident. While rivals were retreating, Lincoln was expanding across the ocean. It opened operations in Canada, England, and Australia during the 1930s, planting flags abroad in the very decade most companies were fighting just to stay open at home. The pattern that would define the next 90 years was already visible. When the world zigged toward fear, this company zagged toward growth. Now hold that thought, because a company cannot pay legendary bonuses on a product nobody wants. Something had to be selling, and selling hard. So what exactly was pouring out of that Cleveland plant? The answer was the arc welder, and it changed everything. Back in 1911, the Lincoln brothers had built their first arc welding machine, a device that used a controlled electric spark to fuse metal to metal. It was a sideline at first, a curiosity next to the motors. But the world was shifting under their feet. Factories, bridges, ships, and pipelines all needed a faster, stronger way to join steel than the old method of hammering in rivets one at a time. Welding was that way. By 1922, the company was selling more welders than motors. The sideline had become the main event, and Lincoln kept sharpening the edge. In 1927, it released a coated welding rod called Fleet Weld that produced joints far stronger and more flexible than bare wire ever could. This mattered more than it sounds. A weld is only as trustworthy as the metal it leaves behind, and John Lincoln had spent years chasing a weld as bendable as the steel around it. When he cracked it, Lincoln did not just sell welders, it sold confidence. Engineers could now trust a welded seam to hold under strain, and that trust would soon be tested on the largest scale imaginable. Because a war was coming, and it would be won partly with a welding torch. When the United States entered the Second World War, it faced a brutal math problem. German submarines were sinking cargo ships faster than America could build them. The old way of riveting a hull together took far too long. Welding was the only answer fast enough, and Lincoln Electric was ready. The company suspended its motor line entirely and threw everything into welding. It hired women and minority workers by the thousands to replace the men who had been drafted, many of them for the first time in the company's history. But the real test was not just building a better weld, it was building it fast enough to outrun a U-boat. The results were staggering. American yards mass-produced 2,700 Liberty ships during the war, welded hulls that could be assembled in days instead of months. What made that speed possible was a technique that hid the arc beneath a blanket of powdered flux, letting a single machine lay down a seam many times faster than a man with a torch, and joining plate far thicker than older methods could handle. Lincoln supplied roughly a third of all the welding electrodes that went into the ships, tanks, and pipelines of the entire war effort. It also shipped welders across the ocean by the thousands, including a huge order sent to Russia to repair war-damaged machinery and another to Britain for battlefield repairs on armored vehicles. The scale is hard to picture, so anchor it to one number. A single Liberty ship swallowed roughly 160,000 pounds of welding electrode. Now multiply that by thousands of hulls, and you begin to see why Cleveland could not make the stuff fast enough. President Roosevelt himself wrote to Winston Churchill about the welding breakthrough that let America build ships at a speed no one had ever matched. Churchill is said to have read the letter aloud in Parliament. A small motor shop had quietly become part of the machinery that beat the Axis. But here is where the story turns from impressive to almost unbelievable. Winning a war is one thing. What Lincoln did in peacetime is what nobody has been able to copy since. In the years after the war, James Lincoln made a promise that most executives would call insane. He guaranteed his workers that they would not be laid off. Not in a downturn, not in a slump, not when orders dried up. The policy became permanent in 1958, and its logic flowed straight from everything he already believed. A man who fears losing his job to his own efficiency will quietly resist every improvement. Remove that fear, and he becomes your greatest inventor. So Lincoln removed it. The promise had rules, and this is where honest history matters. It was never a free ride. To be covered, you had to survive a trial period of a few years and keep meeting the company's standards. In a serious downturn, your hours could be cut and you could be moved to a completely different job, maybe a lower-paying one. The deal was security, not comfort. But the core held. No one at Lincoln's American operations would be shown the door simply because business got slow. And the astonishing thing is that the company kept the promise for decades through recessions that flattened its competitors. Ask yourself how many firms you know that can say the same. The number is almost zero, and that rarity is the whole point. The hardest test came in the early 1980s, and it nearly broke the system. A savage recession hit American industry, and Lincoln's sales collapsed by roughly 40% in a single year. The no-layoff promise now had a gun to its head. So the company did something remarkable. It did not fire people. Factory workers were reassigned to whatever needed doing. Some swept floors or picked up clerical work, while men who had never sold a thing in their lives were handed a bag and sent out on the road to move product. Average pay was cut roughly in half. The executives took cuts too. Nobody was thrown away. And it worked. Lincoln stayed profitable. It still paid a bonus that year. When the economy recovered, it had held on to a skilled, loyal workforce that its rivals had gutted and would spend years trying to rebuild. The bet James Lincoln made in the 1930s had just proven itself in the fire. If that had happened only once, you might call it luck. It happened again. When the Great Recession slammed into the world in 2008 and 2009, Lincoln's sales fell by roughly 30%, the kind of drop that sends most manufacturers straight to mass layoffs. Lincoln did the opposite of retreating. It went on offense and launched more than 100 new products in the teeth of the downturn, giving its salespeople fresh reasons to knock on doors while everyone else was hunkered down. The workforce stayed intact. The promise held a second time, decades after the man who made it had died. That is the difference between a policy and a principle. A policy bends when it gets expensive. A principle is the thing you refuse to break precisely when breaking it would be easiest. You can read this two ways, and both are fair. Critics have called the piecework system relentless, a high-pressure grind where the fast get rich and the slow feel the squeeze. Defenders point out that Lincoln's workers have often been twice as productive as those in rival shops, and paid accordingly, with some floor workers earning six-figure incomes in years when the bonuses ran high. Honest history holds both truths at once. The system asked a great deal. It also delivered a great deal. What it never did was stop growing, and that is the strangest part of all. While the flashy American giants of the 20th century rose on hype and crashed on debt, this stubborn welding company just kept climbing, quietly, decade after decade. Its founders left it a set of values instead of a set of gimmicks, and the values outlasted every trend. The bonus that started in 1934 has now been paid for more than 90 straight years. The layoff promise held for over 70. Through the Depression, a world war, and every recession since, the same simple bargain kept doing its quiet work. Treat the people who build things as partners, and they will build you something that lasts. Today, the numbers speak plainly. Lincoln Electric is the undisputed world leader in welding, running more than 70 manufacturing sites across roughly 20 countries and serving customers in over 160 nations. Its annual sales run north of $4 billion. The little shop that John started with $200 is now worth well over $10 billion on the open market. It is still headquartered in the same corner of Ohio where it began, and it still pays that bonus. Every year, without fail, the envelopes still go out, the same way they did in 1934, the same way they have gone out in every good year and every terrible one since. That worker in 1934 opened an envelope his rivals would never see. A century later, those checks still go out, and the empire still grows. Which giant that mocked this quiet outfit is standing today? Drop your first welder below, the year you ran it, and whether it still fires.